This will be the respiratory system. We're going to look at some structures in the half-head model, plus the larynx model, and then we'll look at some models of the lungs in the torso and some models of the lungs by themselves. Well, I hope you've already gone through and labeled these already, and then we can just check your answers as we go through this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very bottom and then work my way around clockwise, and I'm just going to write the first letter of the structure that it's pointing to. This very first line at the very bottom is pointing to the larynx. The larynx is your voice box, so we have vocal cords inside the larynx. We have different cartilages associated with the larynx. The next line is pointing to the soft palate. The roof of your mouth is called the palate. It's made of the palatine bone plus the palatine process of the maxillary bone. That would be the hard palate, which is going to be the next line, hard palate. The soft palate is just soft tissue and muscles. It ends in the very end of the uvula, but specifically this is pointing to the soft palate. All right, continue on around. This next line is pointing to the nasal cavity. That's easy enough. Nobody ever misses that. And then right above it is a sinus. A sinus is a hollow area inside of one of the bones, and usually it's around the nose, which is why it's called a paranasal sinus. This sinus at the very top, that is the frontal sinus, because it's a part of the frontal bone. All right, continue around. This next line is pointing to another sinus, and this sinus is in the sphenoid bone, so this is the sphenoidal sinus. All right, then we have the last three lines, and it's pointing to parts of the pharynx. The pharynx is an open airway behind the nasal cavity. It's behind the oral cavity, and it's right around and above the larynx. And a couple parts of the pharynx is shared with food and water as well. The upper, most superior part of the pharynx is called the nasopharynx because it is behind the nasal cavity. The next part of the pharynx is called the oropharynx because that is behind the oral cavity. And then the very last line, that is the laryngopharynx because it's right above and right next to or adjacent to the larynx. All right, so let's do that again. This down here is pointing to the larynx. This line is pointing to the soft palate, which is going to be this right here. The next line is pointing to the hard palate, which is right here. This is the bones formed by part of the maxillary bone and the palatine bone. And then all of this right here, that's all nasal cavity. And then right here, that is the frontal sinus. And then right here, that is the sphenoid sinus. And now we have the pharynx. There are three parts to the pharynx. We have this part, which is the nasopharynx. And then we continue down. This is the oropharynx. This is part of the pharynx right behind the oral cavity. This is either for air or food and water, whichever happens to be passing this way. Then continue down. This is the laryngopharynx. It is right next to or adjacent to the larynx. And this is also a shared pathway for either air, which is going to go into the larynx, or food and water, which will then continue down into the esophagus. There's a lot of stuff on this slide, so again, I'm just going to write the first letter of each item, and we're going to start with this line that is right here. That is a cartilage of the larynx called the thyroid cartilage. Right below it, inferior to it, is going to be the thyroid. The next line up is pointing to a piece of cartilage that covers the larynx whenever you swallow, and that is the epiglottis. Epi means above, glottis is the opening between the vocal cords. The next line is pointing to some tonsils. There are three different tonsils associated with the oral cavity, and these tonsils are actually a part of the tongue. They are the lingual tonsils, because lingual means tongue. This next line is pointing to part of the soft palate that hangs down in the back of the throat. That's called the uvula. The uvula has muscle in it, and whenever you swallow, it rises up and then it covers the nasal cavity so that whatever you swallow goes down and not up into the nasal cavity. All right, this next line is pointing to a bone called the inferior concha or inferior concha, either way, but I like to just say concha. Inferior, and then it's concha, C-O-N-C-H-A. This next line is pointing to the middle concha like a snail. It's kind of a curly Q-shaped bone that has mucous membrane that covers the outside of it, but air circulates around the tunnels between the concha, and it helps humidify and warm the air as you breathe in through the nostrils, and then it helps capture that heat and the moisture whenever you breathe out through the nostrils. All right, continuing on the left-hand side, this next line is pointing to the superior concha. So we had inferior concha, middle, and now we have superior concha. All right, the next line is pointing to some more tonsils. These tonsils are located in the nasopharynx, and they're called the pharyngeal tonsils, and they're also known as your adenoids. The next line is pointing to some tonsils in the oral cavity. It's real close to the palate, so they are called the palatine tonsils. So pharyngeal tonsils are in the nasopharynx, palatine tonsils are in the oropharynx. Now the next two lines can be kind of confusing. They are inside the larynx, and there are folds. One of them are called false folds. Some of them are called true folds. The ones that are on top are false folds or false vocal cords, and they're known as the vestibular folds. So the vestibular folds are on top. Below that is the vocal folds or vocal cords. They produce sound whenever they are closed and you blow air through it. The vestibular folds, they don't not close and they don't make any sound. And then the very last line is pointing to another cartilage. It goes all of the way around the larynx, but this is you only see the back part of it in this model, and is the cricoid cartilage. All right, I'm going to switch to the pointer. So again, we're going to start right down here. This is the thyroid cartilage. The next line, this is the epiglottis. The next line is pointing to the lingual tonsils. This line is pointing to the uvula, which is right here. This line is pointing to the inferior concha. This line is pointing to the middle concha. This line is pointing to the superior concha. This line is pointing to the pharyngeal tonsils, also known as your adenoids. This line is pointing to the palatine tonsils right here. This line is pointing to this fold, which are known as the vestibular folds or false vocal cords. This line is pointing to these folds, which are your vocal cords. These are the ones that produce sound whenever they close and you blow air through them. And then this line is pointing to the cricoid cartilage, which is back here. All right, this time we're going to start at the top with this line, and we have these four lines. This one, and then this line, and this line. We'll start at the top first. This very first line is pointing to the epiglottis. That is the piece of elastic cartilage that will fold over the larynx whenever you swallow, so that whatever you swallow goes into the esophagus and not into the windpipe. This next line is pointing to the thyroid cartilage. I want to go ahead and point out something that they don't point out in this model is going to be right here. This is called the laryngeal prominence. This is also known as the Adam's apple, which is right here. Okay, the next line is pointing to the cricoid cartilage. And then the next line is pointing to the tracheal cartilage. So, the cricoid cartilage is the very last cartilage of the larynx. After that, we have the C-shaped rings or incomplete rings of hyaline tracheal cartilage. All right, so epiglottis right here. Thyroid cartilage is right here. Cricoid cartilage is right here. It does form a complete ring. It does go around to the back. And then right here, this is pointing to the tracheal cartilage, which is also a hyaline cartilage. This is a posterior view of the larynx now. And we'll start with this one line over here on the left. And then we'll start at the top on the right-hand side and work our way down. So that first line, it is pointing to the tracheal cartilage. We looked at that earlier on the other side from anterior. Now we can see it from behind, and now we see that it is an incomplete ring. It's a C-shaped ring, and we can see the trachealis muscle, the skeletal muscle that connects to the two ends of the tracheal cartilage. All right, on the right-hand side, this top line is pointing to the epiglottis. just like it was on the other picture, but now we're looking at it from behind. This next line is pointing to the thyroid cartilage. And then this next line is pointing to something called the rima, R-I-M-A, glottidis, Glottidis, Glottidis. It's also pointing to the glottis. The glottis is an opening between the vocal cords or the vocal folds. All right, this last line is pointing to the cricoid cartilage. All right, so we have thyroid cartilage right here, epiglottis right here, thyroid cartilage, it's pointing right here. I could also point right over here either way, but that's all thyroid cartilage. And then right here is the rima glottidis. And then right here is the cricoid cartilage. And it does go all the way around to the front. All right, so many views of the same thing, but I wanted to make sure you had all the pictures for the exam. There are 3 lines. There's going to be this line. We'll start with this one on the right-hand side, and then we'll go around to the left. We'll point to that and this. And again, these are the same things we just looked at in the previous picture. So this top right line is pointing to the epiglottis. Epiglottis being the elastic cartilage that folds over the larynx whenever you swallow. The next line is pointing to the thyroid cartilage. And then the next line is pointing to the cricoid cartilage. Some people pronounce it cracoid, either way. But cricoid sounds better to me. Cricoid cartilage. All right, in this picture here, we can see both lungs. Maybe you have a right and a left lung. So here's one lung, here's the other. We'll go over these labels here in just a second. With the heart and the mediastinum between the 2 lungs. Up here we have the larynx, and then we have the trachea right here. And then we can see the thyroid that wraps around the trachea and it's below the larynx. All right, we're going to start actually on this upper left-hand side. Start with this line, we'll go to this one, and then this one, and this one. End up with that one. And then we'll do the other side. Right here, right here, right here. Okay. On the upper left-hand side, we have the thyroid cartilage again. And it shows the laryngeal prominence, so we can see the Adam's apple. Then right below it, that's the cricoid cartilage. And then below that, now we start looking at the lungs. The lungs are separated into lobes. The right lung has 3 lobes. The left lung has 2 lobes. So on the right-hand side, which is on your left, we'll start with the top line. That is the superior lobe of the right lung. The next line is pointing to the middle lobe of the right lung. And then that last line on the left-hand side is pointing to the inferior lobe of the right lung. All right, now we'll go on the right-hand side. This line first on top, that is the trachea, which is your windpipe. And then the next 2 lines are pointing to lobes of the left lung. There's only 2 lobes of the left lung. So there's a superior lobe of the left lung, and then there's an inferior lobe of the left lung. All right, so right here, that is the tracheal cartilage of the larynx. Right here, that is the cricoid cartilage of the larynx. Right here is the superior lobe of the right lung. Right here is the middle lobe of the right lung. And then right here is the inferior lobe of the right lung. Now we go on our right-hand side. This upper line is pointing to the trachea, which is right here. This line is pointing to the superior lobe of the left lung. And then this line is pointing to the inferior lobe of the left lung. This picture is showing the inside of the lungs. So we're going to start on this right-hand side up here, work our way around clockwise, and then I'll start on the upper left-hand side and go do the last 2 lines. All right, the upper line, the line in the upper right-hand side, that is pointing to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. So that is the larynx. So you have to remember that line is pointing not only to the larynx, but it's also pointing to the thyroid cartilage. So make sure you look for either answer choice. The next line, now we can see the bronchial tree inside of the lungs. The bronchial tree starts with the airways that enter the lungs. We have the primary bronchus, which is first. They are the largest of the airways that go into the lungs. And then they're going to diverge and get smaller and smaller. So the very first branch off of the trachea is the primary bronchus. But this second line is the secondary bronchus. And the next line is a tertiary bronchus. Now we go to the upper left-hand side. This is pointing to the trachea. And then the last line on the bottom is also pointing to a bronchus. Okay, so we have the larynx right here, secondary bronchus right here, tertiary bronchus right here, and then this is a bronchus here. Since it's underneath this branch, it's going to probably be secondary, but we're not going to differentiate between that with this line. And then this line is pointing to the trachea, which is your windpipe. Now we're looking at the lungs and the heart inside of the thoracic cavity. So we're going to start up here in the left-hand side, do those 3 lines, or 4 lines I should say, and then go to the right-hand side to do those last 2 lines. All right, so first up on the upper left-hand side, that is pointing to the superior lobe of the right lung. Second line is pointing to the middle lobe of the right lung. And then the last line is pointing to the inferior lobe of the right lung. Now this bottom line is pointing to the diaphragm, which is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. It is the diaphragm muscle that will contract and lower into the abdominal cavity, which will increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, which decreases the pressure of the thoracic cavity and allows air to enter and fill the lungs. Now we go on the right-hand side. This upper line is pointing to the superior lobe of the left lung, and then this next line is pointing to the inferior lobe of the left lung. All right, so we have superior lobe right here, middle lobe right here, inferior lobe right here, diaphragm is right here. Then we have superior lobe of the left lung right here, and then the inferior lobe of the left lung right there. This is the last slide for the respiratory system, and now we're looking at the sacs of alveoli. These are the alveolar sacs that are going to exchange the gas. It's going to let the oxygen pass through into the pulmonary circulation and allow carbon dioxide to leave the pulmonary circulation. So we'll start with these labels on the left-hand side right here and here, and then cross over to do this one and then this one. All right, upper left-hand side, that is pointing to the pulmonary arterioles. Remember the pulmonary arteries are bringing oxygen-poor blood into the lungs. The pulmonary arteries get smaller into pulmonary arterioles, and then the pulmonary arterioles will then surround the capillaries, which is the next line. So those are the pulmonary capillaries where we have gas exchange. On the right-hand side, this is pointing to pulmonary venules. Pulmonary because it has to do with the lungs. The venules are carrying now the oxygen-rich blood into the pulmonary veins, which will then lead to the left atrium. And then this last line is pointing to the alveoli. The alveoli are the air sacs that are where we have an exchange of gas. You remember from lecture, we have 2 types of alveolar cells. There's alveolar type 1 cells and alveolar type 2 cells. Most of the cells of the alveoli are going to be the type 1 cells because they're simple squamous, and those are the cells that are part of the respiratory membrane where we have gas exchange. All right, so that's the end of the lab portion for the respiratory system.